Chapter 15. Mr. Pedansky filled the canteens. The warden got a pitchfork out of the back of the pickup. She poked it through X-Ray's dirt pile to see if anything else might have been buried in there as well. After you drop off X-Ray, I want you to bring back 3 wheelbarrows, she said. X-Ray got in the pickup. As the truck pulled away, he leaned out of the wide window and waved. 0, said the warden. I want you to take X-Ray's hole. She seemed to know that 0 was the fastest digger. Armpit and Squid, you will keep digging where you have been, she said, but you're each going to have a helper. Zigzag, you help Armpit, Magnet will help Squid, and Caveman, you'll work with 0. We're going to dig the dirt twice. 0 will dig it out of the hole, and Caveman will carefully shovel it into the wheelbarrow. Zigzag will do the same for Armpit, and the same with Magnet and Squid. We don't want to miss anything. If either of you find something, you'll both get the rest of the day off. And a double shower. When the wheelbarrows are full, you are to dump them away from this area. We don't want any dirt piles to get in the way. The warden remained at the site for the remainder of the day, along with Mr. Pedansky and Mr. Sir, who showed up after a while. Occasionally, Mr. Sir would take leave to take water to the other groups of campers, but otherwise he and the water truck stayed parked there. The warden saw it was that nobody in the Group D was ever thirsty. Stanley did the same as he was told. He carefully looked through all the dirt dug up by 0 as he shoveled into the wheelbarrow, though he knew he wouldn't find anything. It was easier than digging his own hole. When the wheelbarrow was full, he took a good distance away before dumping it. The warden couldn't keep still. She kept walking around, looking over the boy's shoulders and sticking her pitchfork through the dirt piles. You're doing just fine, she told Stanley. After a while, she told the boys to switch places so that Stanley, Zigzag, and Magnet Magnet dug holes, and 0, Armpit, and Squid shoveled the excavated dirt into the wheelbarrows. After lunch, 0 took over the digging again, and Stanley returned to the wheelbarrow. There's no hurry, said the warden several times. The main thing is not to miss anything. The boys dug into each hole was well over 6 feet deep and wide. Still, it was easier for 2 boys to dig a 6-foot hole than it was for 1 boy to dig a 5-foot hole. All right, that's enough for today, the warden said. I've waited for this long enough. I can't wait another day. Mr. Sir drove back to the cabin. I wonder how she knew all of our names, Stanley said as he walked back to the compound. She watches us all the time, said Zigzag. She's got hidden microphones and cameras all over the place. In the tent, in the rec room, and even in the shower. The shower? Asked Stanley. He wondered if Zigzag was being paranoid. The cameras are tiny, said Armpit. No bigger than a toenail on your little toe. Stanley had his doubts about that. He didn't think that he could make cameras that small. Microphones, maybe. He realized that this is why X-Ray didn't want to talk to him about the gold tube at breakfast. X-Ray was afraid of the warden and that she may have been listening. One thing was certain, they weren't just digging to build character. They were definitely looking for something. And whatever they were looking for, they were looking in the wrong place. Stanley gazed out across the lake toward the spot where he had been digging. Yesterday, when he found the gold tube, he dug the hole into his memory. Chapter 16. As Stanley entered the rec room, he could hear X-Ray's voice from all the way across the room. See what I'm saying, X-Ray said? Am I right or am I right? The other bodies in the room were little more than bags of flesh and bones, dumped across the chairs and couches. X-Ray was full of life, laughing and waving his arms around as he talked. Yo, Caveman, my man, he called out. Stanley made his way across the room. Hey, slide over here, Squid, said X-Ray. Make room for the caveman. Stanley crashed onto the couch. He had looked for a hidden camera in the shower. He hadn't seen anything, and he hoped the warden hadn't either. What's the matter? Asked X-Ray. You guys tired or something? He laughed. Hey, keep it down, will you? Groaned Zigzag. I'm trying to watch TV. Stanley glanced uncertainly at Zigzag, who was staring very intently at the busted television screen. The warden greeted the boys at breakfast the next morning and went with them to the holes. 4 dug in the holes, and 3 tended to the wheelbarrows. "Glad you're here, X-Ray," she said to him. "We need your sharp eyes." Stanley spent more time pushing the wheelbarrow than digging, because he was such a slow digger. He carted away the excess dirt and dumped it into the previously dug holes. He was careful not to dump any of it into the hole where the gold tube was actually found. He could still see the tube in his mind. It seemed so familiar, but he just couldn't place it. He thought that it might have been the lid of a fancy gold pen. KB could have been in the initials of a famous author. The only famous authors he could think of were Charles Dickens, William Shakespeare, and Mark Twain. Besides, it didn't really look like it was at the top of a pen. By lunchtime, the warden was beginning to lose her patience. She made them eat quickly so they could get back to work. "If you can't get them to work any faster," she told Mr. Sir, "then you're going to have to climb down there and dig with them." After that, everyone worked faster, especially when Mr. Sir was watching them. Stanley practically ran when he pushed his wheelbarrow. Mr. Sir reminded them that they weren't Girl Scouts. They didn't quit digging until after every other group had finished. Later, as Stanley was sat sprawled across the understuffed chair, he tried to think of a way to tell the warden where the tube was really found, without getting himself or X-Ray into any trouble. It didn't seem possible. He even thought about sneaking out at night and digging the hole for himself. But the last thing he wanted to do after digging all day was to dig at night too. Besides, the shovels were locked up at night, presumably so that they couldn't be used as weapons. Mr. Pedansky entered the rec room. "Stanley," he called as he made his way to him. "His name's Caveman," said X-Ray. "Stanley," said Mr. Pedansky. "My name's Caveman," said Stanley. "Well, I have a letter for you from someone named Stanley Yelnats," said Mr. Pedansky. He turned over an envelope in his hands. "It doesn't say Caveman anywhere." Thanks," Stanley said, taking it. It was from his mother. "Who is it from?" Squid asked. "Your mother?" Stanley put in the big pocket of his pants. "Aren't you going to read it to us?" asked Armpit. "Give him some space," said X-Ray. "If Caveman doesn't want us to read it, he doesn't have to. It's probably from his girlfriend." Stanley smiled. He read it later after the other boys had gone to dinner. "Dear Stanley, it was wonderful to hear from you. Your letter made me feel like one of those other moms who can afford to send their kids to summer camp. I know it's not the same, but I'm very proud of you and trying to make the best of a bad situation. Who knows, maybe something good will come of this. Your father thinks he is real close to a breakthrough in his sneaker project. I hope so. The landlord is threatening to evict us because of the door. I feel sorry for the little old lady who lived in a shoe. It must have smelt awful. Love from both of us." "What's so funny?" Zero asked. It startled him. He thought Zero had gone to dinner with the others. "Nothing, just something my mom wrote." "What did she say?" Zero asked. "Nothing?" "Oh, sorry," said Zero. "Well, see, my dad is trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers so the apartment kind of smells bad because he's always cooking these old sneakers. So anyway, in the letter, my mom said she felt sorry for the little old lady who lived in a shoe. You know, because it must have smelled really bad in there." Zero stared blankly at him. "You know the nursery rhyme?" Zero said nothing. "You've heard of the nursery rhyme? The little old lady who lived in the shoe?" "No." Stanley was amazed. "How does it go?" Zero asked. "Didn't you ever watch Sesame Street?" Stanley asked. Zero stared blankly. Stanley headed on to dinner. He would have felt pretty silly reciting nursery rhymes at Camp Green Lake. Chapter 17. For the next week and a half, the boys continued to dig in and around the area where X-Ray had supposedly found the gold tube. They widened X-Ray's hole as well as the holes Armpit and Squid had been digging, until the 4th day, when all 3 holes met and formed one big hole. As the days wore on, the warden became less and less patient. She arrived later in the morning and left earlier in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the boys continued to dig later and later. "This is no bigger than it was when I left you yesterday," she said after arriving late one morning, well after sunrise. "What have you been doing down here?" "Nothing," said Squid. "It was the wrong thing to say." At that moment, Armpit was returning from the bathroom break. "How nice of you to join us," she said. "And what have you been doing?" "I had to, go." The warden jabbed at Armpit with her pitchfork, knocking him backward into the big hole. The pitchfork left 3 holes in the front of his shirt and 3 tiny spots of blood. "You're giving these boys too much water," said Mr. Padansky. They continued to dig until late afternoon, long after all the groups had finished for the day. Stanley was down in a big hole, along with the other 6 boys. They had stopped using wheelbarrows. He dug his shovel into the side of the hole. He scooped up some dirt and was raising it up the surface when Zigzag's shovel caught him in the side of the head. He collapsed. He wasn't sure if he passed out or not. He looked up at Zigzag's wild head staring down at him. "I ain't digging that dirt up," Zigzag said. "That's your dirt." "Hey, Mum," Magna called. "Caveman's been hurt." Stanley brought his fingers up the side of his neck. He felt his wet blood and a pretty big gash just below his ear. Magnet helped Stanley to his feet, then up and out the hole. Mr. Sir made a bandage out of a piece of sack of sunflower seeds and taped it over Stanley's wound. Then he told him to get back to work. It isn't nap time. When Stanley returned to the hole, Zigzag was waiting for him. "That's your dirt," Zigzag said. "You have to dig it up. It's covering my dirt." Stanley felt a little dizzy. He could see a small pile of dirt. It took him a moment to realize that it was the dirt which had been on his shovel when he was hit. He scooped it up, then Zigzag dug his shovel into the ground underneath where Stanley's dirt had been. Chapter 18. The next morning, Mr. Sir marched the boys to another section of the lake, and each boy dug his own hole, 5 feet deep and 5 feet wide. Stanley was glad to be away from the big hole. At least now he knew just how much he had to dig for the day, and it was a relief not to have the other shovel swinging past his face or the warden hanging around. He dug his shovel into the dirt, then slowly turned to dump into a pile. He had to make his turn smooth and slow. If he jerked too quickly, he felt a throbbing pain above his neck where Zigzag's shovel had hit him. That part of his head between his neck and his ear was considerably swollen. There were no mirrors in the camp, but imagined he looked like a hard-boiled egg. He had a hard-boiled egg sticking out of him. The remainder of his body hardly hurt at all. His muscles had strengthened, his hands were tough and calloused. He was still the slowest digger, but not all that much slower than Magnet. Less than 30 minutes after Magnet returned to camp, Stanley spat into his hole. After his shower, he put his dirty clothes in his crates and got out of his box of stationery. He stayed in the tent to write the letters so Squid and the other boys wouldn't make fun of him, writing to his mother. "Dear Mom and Dad, camp is hard but challenging. We've been running obstacle courses and have to swim long distances on the lake. Tomorrow we learn..." He stopped writing as Zero walked into the tent, then returned to his letter. He didn't care what Zero thought. Zero was a nobody. "To rock climb. I know that sounds scary, but don't worry." Zero was standing beside him now, watching him write. Stanley turned and felt his neck throb. "I don't like it when you read over my shoulder, okay?" Zero said nothing. "I'll be careful. It's not all fun and games here, but I think I'm getting a lot out of it. It builds character." The other boys, "I don't know how," said Zero. "What can you teach me?" Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. "Teach you what? To rock climb?" Zero stared at him with penetrating eyes. "What?" said Stanley. He was hot, tired, and sore. "I want to learn how to read." Pause. Chapter 18. The next morning, Mr. Sir marched the boys to another section of the lake, and each boy dug his own hole 5 feet deep and 5 feet wide. Stanley was glad to be away from the big hole. At least now he knew just how much he had to dig for the day, and it was a relief not to have other shovels swinging past his face or the warden hanging around. He dug his shovel into the dirt, then slowly turned to dump it into a pile. He had to make his turn smooth and slow. If he jerked too quickly, he felt a throbbing pain just above his neck where Zigzag's shovel had hit him. That part of his head between his neck and his ear were considerably swollen. There were no mirrors in the camp, but he imagined he looked like a hard-boiled egg sticking out of him. Like he had a hard-boiled egg sticking out of him. The remainder of his body hardly hurt at all. His muscles had strengthened, and his hands were tough and calloused. He was still the slowest digger, but not all that much slower than Magnet. Less than 30 minutes later, Magnet returned to the camp. Stanley spat into the hole. After his shower, he put his dirty clothes in his crate and got out his box of stationery. He stayed in the tent to write a letter so Squid and the other boys wouldn't make fun of him writing a letter to his mother. Dear Mom and Dad, camp is hard but challenging. We've been running obstacle courses and have to swim long distances on the lake. Tomorrow we learn. He stopped writing as Zero walked into the tent, then returned to his letter. He didn't care what Zero thought. Zero was a nobody. To rock climb. I know that sounds scary, but don't worry. Zero is standing beside him now, watching him write. Stanley turned and felt his neck throb. I don't like it when you read over my shoulder, okay? Zero said nothing. I'll be careful. It's not all fun and games here, but I think I'm getting a lot out of it. It builds character. The other boys, I don't know how, said Zero. What? Can you teach me? Stanley didn't know what he was talking about. Teach you what? To rock climb? Zero stared at him with penetrating eyes. What? Said Stanley. He was hot, tired, and sore. I want to learn to read and write, said Zero. Stanley let out a short laugh. He wasn't laughing at Zero. He was just surprised. All this time he had thought Zero was reading over his shoulder. Sorry, he said. I don't know how to teach. After digging all day, he didn't have the strength to teach Zero to read and write. He needed to save his energy for the people who counted. You don't have to teach me to write, said Zero, just to read. I don't have anybody to write to. Sorry, said Stanley. Stanley stared again. His muscles and hands weren't the only parts of his body that had toughened over the past several weeks. His heart had hardened as well. He finished his letter. He barely had enough moisture in his mouth to seal the stamp and the envelope. It seemed that no matter how much water he drank, he was always thirsty.